Hello and welcome back, honeys. Today's full length, the only one probably for the month of July, will be focused on the early history of the medium of photography, hence its very punny name. So today we will be talking about the earliest and most important stuff to know about how the medium came to be and its major firsts, as well as what impacts and legacies are still around today despite advancements in technology. A few of today's sources include PBS, the Moderna Museum in Stockholm, Harvard, the Met Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian, NPR, and the Getty. Our other sources are linked in the Google Doc that is part of the episode description there if you're curious, but I think it's time we begin for the day. Allow me to start, honeys, by giving you a very abridged, very condensed early history of the medium. Our story begins with two major precedents. First, the camera obscura. The combination of those two words literally means dark room in Latin, but the concept, the pinhole camera, has existed for hundreds of years. The Met writes, quote, "The earliest written record of the camera obscura theory in antiquity can be found in the 5th century BCE studies of Chinese philosopher Mo Ti, who lived from 470 to 390 BCE and was also known as Mozi, and who founded Mohism," end quote. Da Vinci also created multiple sketches and studies of such a device, but in the early 1600s CE, humanity was finally able to manufacture high enough quality lenses to create more flexible camera obscuras with larger openings, aka apertures, for the first time, enabling brighter, higher quality images. Camera obscuras were most often used by landscape painters and draftsmen, but as the University of Oxford's History of Science Museum writes, quote, "There's plenty of evidence that masters like Canaletto and Rembrandt used the camera obscura, but other artists may have been more secretive," end quote. And a side note / connection to a past episode here, these camera obscuras were also often used by the European wealthy, making their 18th and 19th century grand tours to make drawings of the landscapes and classical ruins they were seeing along the way. So how exactly does this device work? The box enclosed creates a darkened chamber so that the lens is the only receptor of light from the pinhole. It reflects and focuses the light from this outdoor scene, coming in via that pinhole, onto a mirror, which in turn reflects an inverted 3D perspective accurate image onto a drawing surface. It's almost an inverse of the way that a microscope works. And later versions of the camera obscura had lenses on both sides, both apertures, the pinhole and the reflective lens, to allow for the adjustment of light entry and changing of the tone of the image. Our second major precedent comes in 1794, when Elizabeth Fulhame publishes her book, An Essay on Combustion, describing her 15 years of experiments into the effects of light on silver salts. Fulhame is now recognized for unraveling the theoretical principles of what is now called catalysis via that book, though her discovery was sometimes attributed to the Swedish chemist Jöns Jacob Berzelius in 1835. It's unclear how this happened, given that her book was celebrated by the physicist Benjamin Thompson, later Count Rumsford, who established the Royal Institution, and given that Fulhame was awarded honorary membership of the Chemical Society of Philadelphia for it, a first for the society. Nevertheless, photography historians consider her work on silver chemistry to be a major step in the development of photography. The Royal Society of Chemistry itself writes, quote, "She lays out how she disagreed with the theories of at least 6 leading chemists in the book, including those who supported the popular Flaus-de-Jaume theory of combustion." And I'll break the quote here to say that I would love to be able to explain this to you, but I didn't understand it myself, so getting back into the quote, "She concluded from her experiments that coal burned better when drops of water were added, which would not fit with the Flaus-de-Jaume theory," end quote. That finding and implementation of the technique moved photography forward in a huge way, as we'll see with the rest of our timeline. However, the official invention year of photography is either 1826 or 1827, the year that Frenchman Nicephore Niepce produces the first permanent photograph of a view from nature. Niepce lived 1765 through 1833. The Met explains that Niepce used a technique known as heliography, which involved coating a pewter plate with silver, natural tar, and developing it through light exposure. Titled View from the Window at Le Gras, it's at least the world's oldest surviving photograph. The shot was taken from an upstairs window at Niepce estate in Burgundy, France, and required a very long exposure period, about 8 hours. And because heliography produces one-of-a-kind images, there's no duplicates of this photo. Part of the blurry quality of it is due to changing conditions across that long exposure time, and part of it is the age of the photo. And Niepce's production of this photograph really can't be stressed enough in terms of importance, as well as technical mastery. Khan Academy notes that the secondary problem with producing it was permanence, aka successfully stopping any further reaction of the light-sensitive surface once the desired exposure had emerged. Quote, many of Niepce's early images simply turned black over time due to continued exposure to light. This problem was largely solved in 1839 by the invention of hypo, a chemical that reversed the light sensitivity of paper, end quote. But of course, Niepce had to do it the old-fashioned way, or the old-fashioned way, however you want to put that. As the inventor of the heliography process of photography, a pioneer in the medium, and the producer of the world's oldest surviving photograph, Niepce's legacy is fully cemented into the art historical canon. Then, in 1829, Nicephore Niepce signs a partnership agreement to work on perfecting the photography process with French theater and panoramic painter and diorama owner Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre. And the start of that partnership will change the course of photographic history because, as the Moderna Mosite says, when Niepce died in 1833, Daguerre continued on his own, finding influential friends to promote his photographic inventions. Then, in 1839, two very important things happen. In January, Englishman William Henry Fox Talbot presents to the Royal Society of London a paper on photogenic drawing, aka making permanent camera obscura images with photosensitive silver salts on paper, which is not terribly unlike Niepce's technique. Talbot hoped that his invention's commercial potential lay in the widespread distribution of large editions of photographic prints, which would be its principal advantage over its soon-to-emerge competitors because it uses a negative-positive process. And the competition emerges in August. Before a joint session of the French Academies of Science and Fine Arts, noted French scientist François Arago, as well as Daguerre, announced the details of the first commercially practical photographic process, the daguerreotype. Daguerre's process significantly reduced exposure time and created a lasting result, but also only produced a single image, so the direct positive images boomed in terms of popular interest. A neat twist of daguerreotypes is that they show up best against dark backgrounds. Before the end of 1839, Daguerre's handbook on the daguerreotyping process had been published in French, English, German, Spanish, Danish, and Swedish, but he kept the machinery patents to still make some money. Publication of his instruction manual also leads to a sort of gold rush phenomenon in American photography. The Getty writes, quote, nowhere was the daguerreotype more enthusiastically accepted than in the United States, end quote. So what was so compelling, so special about this particular means of photography? As James Iska, assistant conservator for preparation and framing in the photography conservation department of the Art Institute of Chicago, writes, quote, the true magic of the daguerreotype lies in the quality of the image, unsurpassed in the history of photography in terms of clarity, tonal range, and resolution. As the image is composed of droplets of mercury amalgam, there's no grain, meaning the closer you look, even through magnification, the more detail you will see. The only limit is the quality of the lens used in the creation of the image, end quote. And honeys, I have seen multiple daguerreotypes in art and history museums myself, in photography history classes. I have to agree, it is unsurpassed. There's such a level of lighting, specificity, such a sense of personality. Every flaw and every perfection is present in those images. The daguerreotype also had a very personal nature because they were meant to be held in your hand. They came in small handmade cases, which would show the wear and love of the person who owned it, as they took it out to look at the face of the person within time and again. That case is also somewhat inherently comforting because it has a silk cushion opposite within it to protect the glass plate image. Also in 1839, Daguerre takes the first photo with people in it as well as the oldest surviving picture of Paris. Called Boulevard du Temple, it was a 10-minute-long exposure of the Place de la République. And Robert Cornelius's 1839 image of him sitting in his Philadelphia apartment becomes the first selfie. Cornelius had to sit for a little over a minute to capture this daguerreotype. Shot from his rooftop observatory at New York University in 1840, a daguerreotype taken by John W. Draper becomes the first picture ever taken of the moon. The image has since sustained extensive damage, but we know that a few years later, in 1852, daguerreotypes of the moon by John Adams Whipple through the Harvard College Observatory telescope, one of the largest in the world at that time, will result in a new age of astronomical photography. In 1841, Talbot patents the calotype, a negative-positive process on paper that Harvard writes, quote, greatly increased the photographic sensitivity of the negative and reduced the necessary exposure time in the camera to seconds, end quote. But this one also has a slightly softened, hazy effect. Talbot also becomes the originator of the term photograph, or in Latin, writing with light, at this point for his invention. Even though many different descriptors existed for this medium at the time, photography was soon established as its proper name. In 1843, the first photograph of a U.S. president, a former one, is taken by Philip Haas of John Quincy Adams at home, 14 years after leaving office. And in 1844, Talbot supports Nicholas Hanneman in the creation of a photographic printing establishment in Reading, a town on the route between London and his own home in Laycock, in an effort to encourage the mass production of paper photographs. Between 1844 and 46, the firm publishes what could be regarded as the first photographically illustrated magazine, or book, depending on which source you ask. Talbot's The Pencil of Nature, which, along with 24 plates, a brief text for each, and an introduction describing the history and chemical principles of Talbot's calotype invention, explained how photography could be used in practice. The Met describes these publications as a milestone in the art of book greater than any since the invention of movable type by Gutenberg, though each edition of it was less commercially successful than the previous. And the Moderna Museum notes, quote, despite claiming that its most important use was to produce evidence, he also had artistic ambitions for his photographic images, end quote, as evidenced by the artworks in the book. In 1845, French physicists Louise Fizeau and Léon Foucault take the first photograph of the sun. Our sources write that it is possible to see sunspots even with just a 1/60th exposure image. The Langenheim brothers in Philadelphia introduced the first photographic lantern slide then in 1848, expanding the utility of photography to a suitable form for entertainment and educational purposes. The popularity of this medium lasts until about the 1950s. But in 1850, Frenchman Louis Désiré Blancart Evrard makes positive photographic prints on paper coated with albumen or egg whites. The albumen print boom results in the use of 6 million egg whites annually in England alone, according to 1866 reports by the British Quarterly Review, and cited, of course, by our sources. This may be because, as the National Portrait Gallery of London writes, quote, the resulting paper had a smooth surface with a fine sheen. Albumen prints could be toned with a gold solution, which gave a rich purplish-brown color to the image and reduced the risk of fading, end quote. But their popularity would fade out by about 1900. But the years didn't stop coming, and neither did the inventions. In 1851, Englishman Frederick Scott Archer coats glass plates with a sticky wet collodion and silver salt, inventing the wet collodion process. That form of photography provided an even greater level of detail and clarity, as well as the advantages of less exposure time and less cost than that of daguerreotypes. Harvard says that it remained the dominant glass negative process in the U.S. at least until the gelatin dry plate process was popularized in the 1880s. But we will get there when we get there. One big disadvantage of the collodion process, however, was that it needed to be exposed and developed while the chemical coating was still wet, meaning photographers had to carry portable darkrooms to develop these images immediately after exposure. As you can imagine, that was more than a little inconvenient. In 1854, though, André Adolphe Eugène Désiré of Paris, whose studio was patronized by an elite clientele, including Emperor Napoleon III, invents and popularizes the carte de visite format of photographs. It was called that because these were similar in size to the common visiting card of the period at 9 by 6 centimeters. Désiré was also able to differentiate himself by dividing a single glass plate negative to make 10 different exposures and then printing them simultaneously simultaneously, so there were copies of the same image. As far as I can tell, this was a first in the history of photography. He was so popular, in fact, he opened a second studio sometime before 1862 devoted solely to equestrian portraits, and, read our sources, quote, by the 1870s, cartes de visite were made by the millions worldwide and often collected in albums for home viewing, end quote. Unfortunately, as the Getty says, by that point, Disdry had fallen out of popularity himself in the changing socio-political context of early 1870s Paris. In 1856, the American scientist, photographer, and astronomer Hamilton Smith patents the tintype process, aka the ferrotype. Because ferrotypes, also sometimes called tintypes, were able to be dried and fixed within minutes and were an inexpensive alternative to the daguerreotype, they were often used for portraits by itinerant street photographers. It remained a fairly popular type of carnival photography in the US until about the early 20th century. Then, in 1860, the oldest surviving aerial photograph was taken by James Wallace Black and Samuel Archer King from a hot air balloon of the city of Boston. And you'll notice my choice of words there. That's because the first aerial image ever taken by French photographer and balloonist Gaspard Félix Tourneton has been lost. The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum points out that Black had previously unsuccessfully tried to photograph Providence, Rhode Island from a balloon, but this success over Boston turned out to be useful in a military way, coming just before the Civil War. Quote, photography from balloons became a key tool in military reconnaissance. Thaddeus Lowe, a pioneer in balloon reconnaissance, flew high above the battlefields to observe troop movements during the Civil War, end quote. And balloons continued to be used even into the Cold War for gathering information. For example, the Moby Dick balloon program, which operated under the guise of gathering meteorological info, but which actually spied, of course, on Russia. The year 1870 brings another first. Carol Pop de Chathmarry, the first known war photographer capturing hundreds of images of the Crimean War, takes what is thought to be the first photograph of an actual battle, the Prussians advancing on a group of French soldiers he was with. Then, in the 1870s, things go dry. By that I mean that in 1871, Englishman Richard L. Maddox invents and publicizes the gelatin dry plate process for photography, which uses a pre-treated with gelatin emulsion glass plate method. Because these could be transported, exposed, and then processed at a later date, they were much more practical than wet plate photography processes, according to the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia. A few years later, in 1874, silver gelatin paper, which works very similarly to the gelatin dry plate, becomes commercially available, and its widespread use in the 1890s made it the most common black and white photographic print process of the 20th century. In 1878, many English photographers were working to improve the gelatin dry plate photography process, but Charles Bennett increases the photosensitivity of the silver-salted gelatin emulsion, allowing him to speed up exposure times even further. This catches the attention of one George Eastman, who we'll get to momentarily, who sees a report about this in the British Journal of Photography. As we turn to the year 1882, we'll take a break from some of the scientific, the inventions, and focus on the social for a moment. That's because this is the year that French criminologist and anthropologist Alphonse Bertillon introduces the modern mugshot. Daguerreotypes in the general mugshot style were first made and used by law enforcement agencies, pretty much as soon as photography's invention, as early as the mid to late 1840s in Belgium and England. But while working for the Paris Prefecture of Police, Bertillon becomes frustrated by the relatively tedious and unspecific nature of recording verbal descriptions of criminals and begins standardizing photographic portraits as well as general bodily details like height, eye color, age, other dimensions, and identifiers in the comprehensive files he's creating to help police and victims identify offenders. He especially hopes to target repeat offenders, and this works according to Smart History. Quote, within 10 years of testing his system in Paris in advance of his 1893 book on his system's publication, an additional 5,000 repeat criminals had been identified using the Bertillon system. Pickpocketing incidents fell dramatically in Paris, a decline attributed to Bertillon, end quote. And the Met says that Bertillon would have one of his greatest wins in March of 1892 when his system of identification, quote, led to the arrest of an anarchist bomber who went by the name Ravachol. The publicity surrounding this case earned Bertillon the Legion of Honor and encouraged police departments around the world to adopt his anthropometric system, end quote. However, he did have some kind of extreme egotistical ideas about his system. He thought that the combination of dozens of photographs and bodily measurements, for example, the shape of one's ears and the length of one's middle finger, would be more reliable than solely the mugshot, fair enough, but also the emerging technique of fingerprinting. Maybe not. The more reasonable parts of his system were soon adopted by police in Great Britain, Germany, France, and the United States, and is still the main format for contemporary mugshots. The shoulder-up views of the offender from the front with profiles of each side before a plainish background. However, Burdion's work also got connected to and used in arguments of physiognomy, or the pseudoscience of reading a person's character from their physical appearance, and phrenology, the pseudoscience of measuring bumps on the skull to predict the mental capacities of a subject. Smart History writes that Burdion was aware of and even acknowledged that it might be dangerous, might be possible for his system to, quote, be used to predetermine the physical appearances of criminals and more carefully police a particular constituency, something today we might call stereotyping or racial profiling. His archive was of great interest to others who were eager to put it to use that way, end quote. For example, the disproportionate cataloging of Minneapolis's black women between 1915 and 1919 on charges of being, quote-unquote, alley workers or sex workers. Burdion's system was also used by Francis Galton, the founder of the eugenics movement, who used it as a sort of inspiration and foundation for the thought of photography as a means of providing visual examples of corresponding mental and moral qualities, both positive and negative. He did so to encourage stereotypical assumptions and othering of those he believed were moral deviants. In 1885, George Eastman and William Walker received the patent for the Eastman-Walker roll holder, a device that attaches to cameras and auto-advances the film on them. And this starts a whole new drama in photographic history, because then, in 1887, in December, the Eastman Company starts the use of the Kodak trademark. Meanwhile, at some point during this year, Reverend Hannibal Goodwin, a minister at the House of Prayer in Newark, New Jersey, applies for a patent for the method he has invented of making transparent, flexible film. In 1888, then, Eastman introduces what is commonly called the Kodak camera, but which he calls the roll holder breast camera, which is cheaper, easier to use, and mass-produced than its earlier detective camera. The next year, December of 1889, Henry M. Reichenbach, working for George Eastman, patents a method of making transparent, flexible film, and at some point during the year, Thomas Edison orders specially designed rolls of it for use in his development of a motion picture camera. 1895 is another big year for photography as a medium. The Lumiere brothers of France exhibit the cinema projector, described by the Motion Picture Institute as a, quote, revolutionary combination of camera, film processing, and projection system. It paved the way for the first public screenings of motion pictures, end quote. The Lumiere brothers came from a family of photographers, and this invention was important for multiple reasons. It allowed people to go to the movies for the first time via public motion picture screenings and made it a form of popular entertainment beginning in 1895. The invention sparked international interest in motion pictures and birthed some of the first film markets and theaters in the world, and encouraged directors as well as cinematographers to get artsy with the new possibilities of the technology, including with narrative structures, editing techniques, etc. Some of the norms they established way back then are still seen in films today. Meanwhile, in November of that year, Wilhelm Röntgen of Germany invents the X-ray photograph. Don't have to tell you all what a medical marvel that was, having broken my right wrist twice and needing X-rays for it twice. But those are stories for another day. And between this year and 1898, Eastman buys out 3 companies that hold important roll film system patents to corner the market so that in 1900, they can, Eastman and Kodak that is, introduce the Brownie camera for the low retail price of just $1. 1906 sees the introduction of a photographic method that allows images to be reduced or enlarged, known as the photostat, while 1907 sees Auguste and Louise Lumiere introduce the autochrome, the first color photography system that can be used by amateurs in France. In 1912, 2 men by the last names of Seigrist and Fischer developed the first subtractive color photography process, which will become the basis for Kodak Kodachrome. Then, concluding our Kodak drama, in March of 1914, an appellate court upholds a ruling against the Eastman Kodak Company for infringing on Hannibal Goodwin's patent on transparent flexible film. It ordered Kodak to pay $5 million cash to the company which owned Goodwin's patent, the Amsco Company. And honeys, I just did the conversion. I'm in disbelief. $5 million cash US in 1914 money is $156,845,000 today. You know that had to hurt for Eastman. And to wrap up our early photography timeline, we'll just note that on October 25th of 1925, a Scotsman living in England named John Logie Baird transmitted the first photographic image with a full range of halftones without the use of wires. And of course, there is a direct through line from that transmission to our contemporary TikTok and Instagram soaked age. And now, honeys, some of the originals, the first photographers in this or that area and or their contributions to the field. We pretty much covered the biography of Louis Jacques Monde Daguerre, who lived 1787 to 1851. So let's talk about one of his artworks, titled The Artist's Studio / Still Life with Plaster Casts from 1839. This image is very much in line with the still life tradition and foreshadows the level of clarity we will eventually see in the daguerreotype. Smart History writes, quote, Daguerre's combination of objects obediently remained still for the duration of the long exposure, an estimated 15 to 20 minutes, but also displayed a remarkably wide range of tonal values, variegated textures, highlights, and shadows to add visual interest, end quote. For example, his decision to include putti, which are almost like cherubic figures associated with Phaethon, son of Helios, the Greek god of light. Along with including a ram's head, which also has connections to Helios, Daguerre seems to be doubling down on the fairly obvious connections between photography and light, how light is such a key element for photography, especially at this point. Early reviews of the photo, especially by Parisian press, says he was successful at achieving the sort of artistic goals he was after, but was apparently not quite enough for Alphonse de Caillot, who became the director of the Louvre in 1836 and would not accept the photo into the French Academy of Fine Arts, the most important quote-unquote tastemaker in Paris in the 1830s. This likely wasn't personal, however, it was just simply most museums didn't show photography at all until the 20th century. Next, we look at Robert Adamson, who lived 1821 to 1848, and David Octavius Hill, who lived 1802 to 1870. Hill was a portrait painter who became the secretary of the Royal Scottish Academy in 1843, and Robert Adamson was an engineer who suffered from poor health from childhood and thought a photography career would be less stressful on his body. Their partnership was formed in Edinburgh in July of 1843, just 4 years after the announcement of the invention of photography. The scientist Sir David Brewster introduced them to each other as well as the calotype to Scotland, thus beating out the daguerreotype competition. Scotland was also exempt from Talbot's patent restrictions, and the Met says, quote, in fact, Talbot encouraged its use there, end quote. And their partnership was pretty formidable. The National Gallery of Art Scotland reports, quote, they produced a remarkable body of work that included portraits, landscapes, and social documentary. Their work had an enduring influence on photography worldwide and stands as one of the earliest and most important contributions to the art form, end quote. One big example of this influence and body of work, Hill had been assigned to portray a group of several hundred participants, clergymen and laymen, who had left the Church of Scotland and founded the Free Church of Scotland, and additionally wanted to use photographs to create individual as well as small group portraits of them. Once Adamson became part of the project and the photography became the avenue of making this happen, it still took the pair more than a year to produce the calotypes, in part because the light required to make the images entailed creating convincing indoor sets in the outdoors, and another 20 years after that to paint the group portrait of the signing of the deed of demission. Yet it seems as though the photos were the strong suit of this project. The Met writes, quote, the final composition, not completed for 2 decades decades and as dull a work as one can imagine, lacks not only the fiery dynamism of Hill's first sketches of the event, but also the immediacy and graphic power of the photographs that were meant to serve it, end quote. Again, though, they were not limited to that more serious project. They additionally recreated scenes from the literary works of Sir Walter Scott, tapping into the Scott mania of the time and using other artists as models. They further documented the Gothic tribute to Scott throughout its construction. Our sources paid special attention to their project documenting working men and women in the fishing village of New Haven near Edinburgh, and how its style is more natural and personal than typical for the time. One such photo for the unrealized volume, The Fishermen and Women of the Firth of Forth, entitled New Haven Fishwives, shows two women in their traditional striped working dresses and white caps who seem to be taking a little rest against a nondescript outdoor background with willow baskets filled with fish nearby them. And what caught my attention here is that they seem to be tropes more than people. They have unclear averted faces and not really any indications of personality. Our sources explain this may be due to two reasons. One, quote, the men and women of New Haven with their distinctive costumes and folkways were part of the popular imagination in the 19th century and were featured in literature and stage plays, end quote. And this image speaks to the perceptions of New Haven as industrious, idyllic. They write, we should also consider the Industrial Revolution context. Because New Haven was seen by many of the time as a model of a thriving, self-sustaining pre-industrial society in contrast to the slums emerging around Edinburgh, some scholars suggest New Haven photographs were this pair's contribution to the ongoing debates about the unemployed, the urban poor, and other socioeconomic issues. Another example of their work from about 1845, the Mrs. Grierson, looks like a sort of cuddly image between two sisters, one playing with the other's hair while standing behind her and leaning over a shoulder for conversation, both with these sort of like adorably concentrated looks on their faces, like they're trying so hard to act out whatever emotion he's telling them to. And they're against a relatively plain, perhaps outdoor background as well. The pair continued working together until Adamson's premature death 4 years after the partnership began, and that duo always signed their nearly 3,000 photographs of architecture, landscapes, and portraits together. Says the Moderna Museet, quote, Adamson's contribution to the partnership was so significant that with the exception of a brief partnership with Alexander McGlashan in 1860, there is little evidence to suggest that Hill made any serious attempt to continue photographing without his partner, end quote. However, the duo got a sort of a second life thanks to the pictorialist movement of the 1880s through 1920s. The movement idolized them quite a bit, and Alfred Stieglitz even republished a series of photogravures of Hill and Adamson's original images in his photography journal Camera Work in the early years of the 20th century. Our next original is Oscar Gustav Rylander, who lived 1813 through 1875. Little is known about the early life of one of the few internationally famous Swedish photographers before he settled in Britain around 1840, but it's believed that he studied art or art history due to distinct influences from the Italian Renaissance, the Spanish Baroque, Dutch 17th century painting, and the British Pre-Raphaelites in his work. Rylander began work as a photographer in 1852, which continued until his death. He would later claim that his only formal instruction was a single afternoon's lessons with Nicholas Henneman, William Henry Fox Talbot's former assistant, but given the complexity of the wet plate process which Rylander used, our sources think this is quite unlikely. He did, however, specialize in genre scenes of domestic life, and like many, used his friends and neighbors as models, but he also earned a modest income making photographic studies for other artists, most likely including Sir Lawrence Alma Tadema, under the belief that photography would make painters more careful draftsmen. While the Science and Media Museum calls him, quote, the flamboyant and mysterious photographer who pioneered the painstaking technique of combination printing, end quote, the Moderna Museet focuses on the fact that he would build and photograph sort of tableaux vivants or stage scenes in his studio. His work also included photographic series of poor children and families, and Rylander actually met Charles Darwin towards the end of his life and was commissioned to illustrate the biologist's acclaimed book, The Expressions of the Emotions in Man and Animals, from 1872. We'll focus on two artworks, photographs, to demonstrate his style, beginning with First I Lost My Pen and Now I've Lost My Spectacles, whose date is unknown known. In the photograph, a man in normal for the era clothes searches through a small tabletop full of papers for said lost items, the first of which, the pen, is in his mouth, and the second, the spectacles, are on his head, while a chair sits pushed in and a woman peeks at him from behind a curtain to the left. I included this image because this sense of humor in his photographs, the overall level of emotion he captured, was very unusual for the time, according to today's sources. But perhaps his most famous work is titled The Two Ways of Life from 1857. This is a negative montage consisting of approximately 30 exposures combined into a single composition considered by the Met to be, quote, one of the most ambitious and controversial photographs of the 19th century, end quote, for the following reasons. Not only does it contain multiple nude figures, but it is also an allegorical depiction of the choice between vice and virtue. In it, a bearded sage leads two young men from a painted countryside background of this stage of life onto its center, and the rebellious one at our left runs for the pleasures of lust, gambling, and idleness, while the other chooses the righteous path, religion, marriage, so on. In spite of its mixed reception, the Science Media Museum points out that Queen Victoria must have been impressed since, quote, she bought a copy as a gift for her beloved Albert after seeing it exhibited at the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition, end quote. Next up is Julia Margaret Cameron, who lived 1815 through 1879. She was an amateur photographer who was mainly active in the 1860s and 1870s. Cameron acquired her first camera at the age of 48, but would create thousands of exposures and, quote, leave an enduring image of the Victorian era as an age of intellectual and spiritual ambition, end quote, in the words of the Morgan Library and Museum. Her photographs were inspired by myths, biblical stories, and English literature. They have a characteristically soft, expressive focus that is reminiscent of the Pre-Raphaelites and Renaissance painting. For that reason, she was more accepted by, tied to, and arguably at the center of the photographic part of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. This was an extremely unusual position for a woman of her day. The Moderna Musée writes, quote, in Victorian Britain, a small group of photographers were the very first to attempt to create and formulate art photography. Julia Margaret Cameron, who belonged to this group, left behind a fantastic collection of intimate portraits of her family and large circle of friends, end quote. Yet, unlike many other early photographers, she would leave fingerprints on the glass negatives or use motion blur or selective focus. She was much more concerned with the creation of ethereal scenes, engaging with photographic accidents and with beauty. She was not seeking technical perfection. She was not looking to capture or document reality, says the art story. Cameron also had an atypically non-hierarchical approach to choosing her subjects, caring more for that aspect than specific sitters as well as science, though she did admire the latter part. And speaking of science and arts, she was very well connected. She took portraits of Charles Darwin, Thomas Carlyle, G.F. Watts, Henry Taylor, and Alfred Tennyson during her career. She was additionally given a studio space in the South Kensington Gallery, now the Victoria and Albert Museum, in 1868, qualifying her as the gallery and thus the museum's first artist in residence. This was due in part to her longtime relationship with its director and curator, Sir Henry Cole. Cameron's impact has nevertheless been long-lasting. Some attention has been drawn in a recent hyperallergic article to her contributions to less savory Victorian legacies, but she still has become an influential mother figure for subsequent generations of modern and contemporary photographers, especially those with particular interest in making sensitive or revealing images. For example, Dorothea Lange and Sally Mann, as well as for those interested in surrealism and softness in images, like Francesca Woodman. Cameron's oeuvre supports key theoretical debates surrounding the relationship between photography and time due to her special focus on experimenting with characteristics of photography like focus and exposure that are unique to the medium. As far as her artworks go, the inspiration from Tennyson was very strong. It's seen in works like The Angel at the Grave as well as Maud, and the fact that, quote, Cameron's last major photographic project in the UK before she and her family moved to Ceylon, or present-day Sri Lanka, was to illustrate Tennyson's work Ideals of the King, 1874 through 75, end quote. But for today, we will look at 1865's Sappho. This is a half-length image modeled by Mary Hiller, who often sat for Cameron, who was dressed in a heavily embroidered dress and antique-looking coin necklace with the pre-Raphaelite half-up, half-down hairstyle. She also holds a lyre to symbolize lyric poetry. This is considered a quote-unquote unsurprising subject for Cameron, as it is a standout female artistic and intellectual figure from antiquity. Although the art story does write that Cameron was criticized for, quote, using the inherently truthful medium of photography to depict imaginary subjects, suggesting that her images be used for only painting studies, end quote. unquote. So she definitely got some misogynistic pushback for taking artistic license with her images and being that sort of trailblazer friend to happy accidents. Another notable image of hers is Mayday from 1866. It has very strong compositional similarities to fellow pre-Raphaelite Dante Gabriel Rossetti's 1865 through 66 painting, The Beloved or The Bride. Rossetti's work was completed just shortly before this photo was taken, and here we see the English rural custom of crowning a young and beautiful girl as the Queen of May on the 1st of that month occurring. This is one of Cameron's series of large-scale close-up heads taken with her new larger camera that she obtained sometime in late 1865. This one held a 15 by 12 inch glass negative instead of the 12 by 10 inch negative of her first camera. And with that changing camera, you can sense a little bit of growth in Cameron's style here. There's a little more layering of the figures, a few more figures in the first place. Next up we have Carl Kerman, who lived 1833 to 1913, a physician who studied both medicine and art as a young man, eventually becoming a famous balneologist in Lysekil. He was never a professional photographer, but is one of many practitioners who've made their mark on the history of photography through his various projects, especially those completed during that balneologist role. Kerman not only initiated the plan for public baths in Stockholm and eventually also the Sturbadet swimming baths, he was a pioneer of medical photography, building a photographic studio at the Karolinska Institute in the early 1860s before being appointed a professor of plastic anatomy at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in 1869. Pictures documenting his lectures show students gathered around Kerman for human dissections. Unfortunately, we could not find any surviving photos of his to talk about today, and also this is another case where photographic studies of the human anatomy were used in the emerging field of eugenics, though I couldn't find much detail on how or why. An unfortunate legacy, but one we must acknowledge to tell the truth of the history of photography. And our final photographer for the day, honeys, is Rosalie Showman, who lived 1833 to 1919. One of many prominent women photographers who opened a studio in 1864 in Stockholm after being widowed with 3 small children. Her oeuvre includes numerous carte de visite portraits and cabinet cards, the format which eventually replaced carte de visites, and all of these are a mixture of hand-tinted classic portraits, various stage scenes, people wearing local folk costumes, and mosaics, and several of them even feature her daughter Alma. Our sources do note that the photographer Carl Jacob Malberg had his studio at this address previously, and there are some indications that Showman may have been working for him at first. Part of her success was also the timing, however. Photography went from being an exclusive novelty into a more widespread and popular medium with the photographic advances of the 1860s. Regardless, her business prospered to the point that by the end of the 1870s, or the stabilizing of the quote-unquote cartomania market, Showman had 5 female employees. Our sources say she seems to have chosen to hire women only, and R. Showman and Comp later opened studios on another local street, as well as in Kalmar, Halmstad, and Vaxholm. And the only example of her artwork that I could find is a piece titled Alma from about 1880. In it, a woman, presumably her daughter, stares out at us with an almost impatient expression from a photo frame which is sitting atop a small table with flower bouquets at each of the corners, the top left and the bottom right of it. It gives this like frame within frame sort of 3D effect. But the image is sort of creepy in that Alma appears like an angel with the light behind her, even wrapping around over her shoulders to give a floating head effect. Even though I suspect there's some transposition, some layering going on here, there are very clear details in all of these components. It is done well. All right, and with our wrap up of the originals, we are wrapping up our episode as well. I hope you have enjoyed our summary of some of the major firsts of the photographic medium. I hope you enjoyed learning about the impacts and legacies of some of its greatest figures, some of the technological advancements. We hope to catch you again in a couple of weeks when we're back from vacation. And until that point, honeys, take care, hydrate or dehydrate, stay safe, all that good stuff. We'll talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.